and I believe that God plays all the parts. Purpose of the play? To transform man, the created, into God, the Creator. God loved man, his created, and became man in faith that this act of self-commission would transform man, the created, into God, the Creator. The play begins with the crucifixion of God on man as man, and ends with the resurrection of man as God. God becomes as we are, that we may be as he is. God becomes man, that man may become first a living being, and secondly, a life-giving spirit. I live, yet not I, but God lives in me, and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. God took upon himself the form of man, and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross of man, and is crucified on Golgotha, the skull of man. God himself enters death's door, the human skull, and lays down in the grave of man to make man a living being. God's mercy turned death into sleep. Then began the prodigious and unthinkable metamorphosis of man, the transformation of man into God. No man, unaided by the crucifixion of God, could cross the threshold that admits to conscious life. But now we have union with God in his crucified self. He lives in us as our wonderful human imagination. Therefore man is all imagination, and God is man, and exists in us, and we in him. The eternal body of man is the imagination. That is God himself. When he rises in us, we will be like him, and he will be like us. Then all impossibility will dissolve at the touch of exaltation, which his rising in us will impart to our nature. Here is the secret of the world. God died to give man life and to set man free. For however clearly God is aware of his creation, it does not follow that man, imaginatively created, is aware of God. To work this miracle, God had to die, then rise again as man. And none has ever expressed it so clearly as Blake. Blake says, or rather has Jesus said, "Unless I die, thou canst not live. But if I die, I shall arise again, and thou with me. Wouldst thou love one who had never died for thee, or ever die for one who had not died for thee? And if God dieth not for man, and giveth not himself eternally for man, man could not exist. So God died. That is to say, God has freely given himself for man. Deliberately, he has become man, and has forgotten that he is God, in the hope that man, thus created, will eventually rise as God. God has so completely offered his own self for man, that he cries out on the cross of man, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He has completely forgotten that he is God. But after God rises in one man, that man will say to his brother, "Why stand we here, trembling around, calling on God for help, and not ourselves, in whom God dwells?" This first man that has been raised from the dead is known as Jesus, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For man, God died. Now by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. Jesus resurrects his dead father by becoming him. In Adam, the universal man, God sleeps. In Jesus, the individualized God, God wakes. In waking, man the created has become God, the Creator, and can truly say, "Before the world was, I am." Just as God, in his love for man, so completely identified himself with man that he forgot that he was God. So man, in his love for God, must so completely surrender himself to God that he lives the life of God and no longer that of man. God's play, which transforms man into God, is revealed to us in the Bible. It is completely consistent in imagery and symbolism. The New Testament is hid in the Old Testament, and the Old is manifested in the New. The Bible is a vision. It is not a doctrine or a ritual. The Old Testament tells us of God's promises. The New Testament tells us not how these promises were fulfilled, but how they are fulfilled. The central theme of the Bible is the direct, individual, mystical experience of the birth of the child. That child of whom the prophet spoke. To us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. When the child is revealed to us, we see it, we experience it, and the response to this revelation can be stated in the words of Job. I had heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees. The story of the Incarnation is not fable, allegory, or some carefully reasoned formula to enslave the minds of men, but mystical fact. It is a personal mystical experience of the birth of oneself out of one's own skull, symbolized in that of a child wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying on the floor. There is a distinction between hearing of this birth of a child from one's own skull, a birth which no scientist or historian could ever possibly explain, and actually experiencing the birth, holding in your own hand and seeing with your own eyes this miraculous child, a child born from above, out of your own skull, a birth contrary to all the laws of nature. The event, as it is recorded in the Gospels, actually takes place in man. But of that day or that hour, when the time will come for the individual to be delivered, no one knows but the Father.